Good evening. Welcome to St. George's House in Conversation, one of the ways in which we try to keep in touch with people as we all live through this pandemic. We're delighted that so many of you can be with us tonight, and I know that many of you already know St. George's House and our work, but I'm also aware that there are a good number of people this evening who are joining us for the first time. So I thought I might say a few quick words about the house, what it is and what we do. St. George's House was founded in 1966 by His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh. The intention was to create a safe space where people from right across society, from all walks of life, might gather to grapple with topics of national and indeed international significance. Our aim is to nurture wisdom through dialogue, and we try to do this in a series of consultations, by which I mean we bring people together, usually over 24 hours, and during that time they work through a carefully calibrated program which lays bare all the issues, the nuances, and the arguments around the topic to hand. Now, we're not after consensus, welcome though that is, but we do hope that when people leave a St. George's House consultation, they will do so much more deeply informed about the arguments around a particular topic and much better acquainted often with people whose opinions and views are diametrically opposed to their own, and that they might take whatever wisdom has been garnered back into society and put it to use for the greater good. Now, the House also hosts a series of clergy courses. We have a leadership program, the Society of Leadership Fellows, and each year we host a number of high-profile lectures. But do take a look at our website, www.stgeorgeshouse.org, where you'll find much more detail about what we are and what we do. But thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you also to those of you who have sent in some questions in advance. I'll try to get through as many of them as I can. However, it's now a particular pleasure to welcome Rabbi Jonathan Romain. Many of you will know Jonathan through his broadcasts on television and radio, through his writings in the newspapers, The Times, The Guardian, the Jewish Chronicle. Jonathan is a great friend of St. George's House with a long-standing association. He has been a fellow, he has been on our board and our council, and he is a man of sound wisdom and sound advice. He is also a campaigner around issues such as assisted dying, interfaith marriage, faith schools, and I have no doubt we'll come to some of those issues in the course of our conversation. But Jonathan, for now, I just want to welcome you back virtually to St. George's House, and I want to take you right back to the beginning by asking you what it was that drew you to the religious life. I mean, was there a moment? Was there an epiphany? Was there a moment when you felt this was a clear vocation? What was the impetus?
You know, I so wish you hadn't asked me that question because I'm going to have to disappoint you by saying, no, there was no thunderclap, there was no moment of vision. It was just a growing feeling. I'd always liked Judaism and being Jewish. A very particularly Jewish history. And then it sort of occurred to me that being a rabbi would be a way of me exploring that more, but also would be quite useful, hopefully, to other people, being sort of involved in communal life. And it seemed to sort of be, for both selfish reasons, but altruistic reasons, the sort of ideal path. And I had that idea when I was about 12 or 13, I think. I probably had a very naive idea, you know, Gary, sort of thundering down from the pulpit, hellfire and brimstone. It was a bit of a shock when I found we didn't actually have hellfire and brimstone in Jewish theology. That's other people's lot. But never mind, as I grew, the idea grew. And really, I've never looked back and really enjoy it. And frankly, I thoroughly recommend it as a career path because, you know, it's a wonderful job. You know, one of the great things is that no day is ever the same. I mean, you know, and each day is different. You know, I might start off doing a school assembly, then do a hospital visit, then do a radio broadcast, then go and visit somebody at home, and then help with a homeless lunch, and 101 things. So it's just a wonderful life, and I really enjoy it.
Well, and Jonathan, I think I'm right in saying that you've been rabbi now in Maidenhead for just over 40 years. Is there a downside to being in one place for so long?
Well, a downside and an upside. I mean, it's quite unusual, to be honest. And when I came to Maidenhead, in fact, it was a tiny, tiny community. And they actually said to me, because I was their first full-time rabbi, we actually don't have much money in the kitty. And you can only stay here for 3 years. Well, the community grew and I sort of stayed with it. And I think we were initially about 80 families. We're now about 850. So, yes, there's always a danger, of course, that you can get stale in any job if you stay there too long. I've tried to mitigate that by having lots of other activities, the campaigns you've mentioned. But there's also an upside, which is that you become the family rabbi. And, you know, I am now doing the baby blessing of people who parents are not only married, but I did their bar mitzvah, I did their baby blessing, I perhaps married their parents, I may even have buried their grandparents. So you actually span the generations, and it's enormously enriching to grow with the families and the community.
And of course, Jonathan, these are extraordinary times for all of us with COVID-19, although hopefully now there is an end in sight. But has that changed your congregation in any way? Has it changed the way people worship? And will we go back to normal when all this is behind us?
Yes and yes, in the sense that it certainly has changed things in that we've suddenly leapt into the technology, which we should have leapt into a long time ago, but we didn't, such as live streaming, and particularly Zoom, which frankly most of us hadn't heard of before March, unless you thought it was a lollipop or something like that. You remember those Zoom lollipops? But anyway, and we now do a lot of things by Zoom, a bit like we're doing this, of course. And it can be a little bit impersonal, obviously, but it also enables people to be present together, and it's certainly overcome the problem of COVID-19 distancing. We will go back to normal. I'm quite sure of that in due course, but it won't be the same normal. And we will take on board the technological advances. And I suspect, and this will apply to other synagogues and churches, and maybe St. George's as well, that we'll always have a two-tier approach from now, and there'll always be a computer so that somebody from in America or in Bradford or Manchester or wherever can still be part of it as well as live. So we'll have to get used to that sort of two-tier system.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more that the two-tier system can work to all our advantages. In fact, some people listening might remember that we held this year's Elson Ethics lecture on Zoom, and were able to engage a speaker from Washington, D.C., which was really terrific. So I think it does open opportunities for us all. Jonathan, I said in my introduction that you were a campaigner, and there are indeed a number of issues that you've engaged with, and you're certainly not afraid to put your head above the parapet. But I think perhaps one of the most standout issues in recent times came when you recommended to your congregation at the last general election that they should not vote for the Labour Party. And this attracted a huge amount of publicity. Now, I know that anti-Semitism was at the back of all this, but I just wonder now, in retrospect, if you would take us through that issue as you saw it.
Yes, I was very worried by the Corbyn phenomenon. I didn't know, and I still don't know, whether he personally is anti-Semitic, but it was no doubt that he allowed anti-Semitism to permeate the party, not just at MP level, but at local and activist level. And there's always been prejudiced individuals. There always is, there always will be. That's just the way of the world. But for me, it crossed the red line. Individuals, okay, you can put up with. It's when institutions become anti-Semitic or racist, by which I would mean, newspapers, BBC, NHS, whatever. That's a very dangerous thing. And it seemed to me this was the first time it was happening in Britain. And it was also astonishing it was happening to the Labour Party, which by and large had a very good record on anti-discrimination, anti-prejudice. Now, up to then, there'd been this unwritten rule, but very strictly observed, not to mix religion and politics, in the sense that, of course, rabbis and vicars and priests can talk about political issues, such as, the arms trade or homeless or soup kitchens, but not about party politics. They shouldn't do party politics. But I really felt that I had to speak out because this had, as I said, crossed the red line. So I crossed my red line, really. And I told people, not just in my own community, but anyone who would listen in the community at large, to vote for whichever party was likely to defeat Labour in the particular constituency in which they lived. And there was a nuance here, Gary, in the sense that I wasn't telling them who to vote for, but who to vote against. And also I made it very clear I wasn't against Labour, it was against Corbyn-led Labour. This was a new phenomenon. I mean, Labour under any other leader, whether it was on the far left with Michael Foot or the right with Tony Blair or somewhere in the middle with Neil Kinnock, never heard it being a problem with anti-Semitism. It was clearly to do with Corbyn. And the reaction was interesting, because a lot of lay people, with some exceptions, by and large, it was overwhelming support for my position. But from the ministers, with one or two exceptions, it was very critical because they felt I had crossed that red line. Interestingly enough, I also got phoned up by the police commissioner the next day and offered police protection to have an armed officer on my door outside my house. I turned it down and it wasn't necessary. And I think the whole issue, not me personally, but the anti-Semitism issue actually was one of the contributing factors of the defeat for Labour in a small way. Firstly, because it sort of dented the image of integrity that he had. And actually, this was clearly something that was a major problem and still is. And also, a lot of people said to me, if you've got a blind spot in this issue, what other blind spots does he have? And I have to say, I'm very pleased that Keir Starmer has now taken the Labour Party in a new direction, or maybe it's better to say back to where it was.
Well, and I suppose, you said there that you'd crossed your own red line, and I'm remembering the famous moment when Tony Blair, as Prime Minister, was asked about faith, his faith, and Alistair Campbell stepped in and said, "We don't do God." That politicians, the implication was politicians shouldn't engage with religion, and there will be a large number of people who would say that religious leaders shouldn't engage with politics. You've done it very openly on this particular issue. Is this something you'll continue to do now that you've crossed that red line?
No. I've gone back to the other side. It was an extraordinary situation, as I think people recognised, and the mere fact that, for instance, the EHRC, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, took Labour and issued this very damning report. And as you probably know, the only time a political party had that before was the British National Party. And to actually talk about Labour and the British National Party in the same sentence, would be unthinkable 5 years ago. And yet it happened. It was, what happened under Corbyn, I think it's true to say, was an aberration. And now we can go back to the normal, and my red line is firmly in place.
Okay, and I do want to move us on because people have sent in other questions, but I just want to ask you one other question on the anti-Semitism issue. Is it anti-Semitic to criticize Israel?
Not at all. Absolutely not at all. Israel is a country like Britain, and it has its imperfections. And in fact, the greatest critics are in Israel itself. And if you look at the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, there is, the people will be there every day criticizing government policies. It is anti-Semitic to say that Israel shouldn't exist. it is not anti-Semitic to say that this or that policy is right or wrong.
Now, I mentioned in the introduction a number of the issues that you've engaged with. One of those was assisted dying, a topic indeed we dealt with as part of a consultation here at St. George's House, and an area I'm sure we will return to. You're in favour of changing the law around assisted dying and making it legal. Why so?
Well, I changed my mind on this subject. Originally, I sort of was against it for all the reasons that people are. But then as I saw more and more people in hospices and hospitals suffering, I thought, this can't be right. And also I was persuaded by the safeguards that were being proposed in the various bills that went before Parliament, the Faulkner Bill in the Lords or the Maris Bill in the House of Commons. By the way, just to define our terms, assisted dying is a voluntary act. It's where someone is an adult, mentally competent, suffering and dying. That's the crucial bit. They are already dying. There's no question about that. And that's defined as being within the next 6 months. And for me, this wasn't just a matter of common sense to allow someone to let go of life rather than suffer on in agony. It was a religious response. And there's nothing sacred about suffering, nothing holy about agony. Which is why I set up an interfaith group of of clergy from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faiths, which include a bishop, by the way, include former Archbishop George Carey, and was actually also supported by the statement of former Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who also came out in favour of assisted dying. Because all the options at the moment are all bad options. You know, if you are dying in pain, and by the way, if you want to carry on till your last dying breath, great, that's wonderful, and I suspect most of us will. But if you are dying in pain, then you can either have to just suffer on, or commit suicide, or starve yourself to death, or try and go abroad to Switzerland to Dignitas. They're all bad options. And therefore, we're pressing for the government to allow it for those who so wish to be legal in this country with very strict conditions, as I said, and with judicial oversight. And what's really interesting is that the tide has really changed in recent, well, just the last year or so. I mean, all the polls show that there's about 81% in favour in the population at large. MPs are now changing their mind. Medical organisations who were opposed, Royal College of Physicians have gone to neutral now. British Medical Association is heading that way too. And interestingly enough, the Health Secretary has recently, Mr. Hancock has said that it should no longer be a matter in the Justice Department, but in the Health Department. In other words, this is part of end-of-life care, and we should be able to choose how we spend our final days.
But when you talk about the safeguards, Jonathan, I know one of the arguments is, of course, the safeguards can be logical and strong and secure, but in the wrong hands, they're not really safeguards. It's the slippery slope argument. How would you counter that?
I would agree with you, but for one fact. In this rare example, it is rare, I would make the claim that we can see the future. Now, that sounds a bit outrageous, but we really can, because exactly the same procedures that are being proposed here have actually already been in place in Oregon for the last 25 years. And we've seen what's happened, and that there hasn't been a slippery slope. And that although a lot of people have applied for the paperwork, very few have taken it up. In other words, it's been there as an emotional safety net. And, you know, I certainly know when I speak to groups, and there are intellectual arguments for and against, fair enough. But when I say at the end, look, if you were in that position personally, would you like to have the option? And everyone says, yes, I'd like to have that option. So it's a matter of giving people the option, giving people the right. And what's interesting in Oregon is that the people who do tend to go for assisted dying are people who are used to autonomy. In other words, they're not sort of the proverbial little old lady who's being battered. They are people, you know, who are educated, who are and who have been used to making their own decisions about their business life, their hobbies, their personal life, their relationships, and now want to make the same choice about their death and whether to stagger on to the final moment or let go 3, 4, 5 weeks earlier instead.
Okay. And Jonathan, in your book, Inclusive Judaism with David Mitchell, you write quite a bit about interfaith marriage. And I think that got you into quite a bit of bother early on. Is that right?
Bother is a mild word. I got crucified. Yes. Yeah, I mean, going back, intermarriage used to be seen, I'm talking about now the 1980s, so it's not prehistory, it's just recent, really. It was seen as the great sin. You were rejecting tradition, you were sort of undermining the future, and the result was that people who married out of their faith were often ostracized by the family or the community. But it became very clear to me that, number one, mixed faith marriage is inevitable in an open pluralist society, and people who work together during the day will play together at night. Secondly, these people were not rejecting their faith or their family. They would have been very happy marrying a fellow Jew, fellow Catholic, whatever. They just so happened to meet someone of a different faith at the gym, at the university, at the office. And by the way, it's not just a Jewish problem. This affected all religious groups, the church, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus as well. So what I tried to do was help couples find ways of keeping their own religious identity, along with respecting that of the other person within the integrity of the marriage, and also being able to pass on the tradition to their heritage. Now, as I say this, I'm quite sure that most people think that sounds common sense, but believe it, or at least I hope you will, but believe it or not, back in the 1980s, it was revolutionary, which is why I got lambasted by some, but in the end, I actually got the MBE for pioneering a new path.
And what was the counter argument? Why were you lambasted? What was the opposing view?
Well, the opposing view was, and you still find it in some circles, that you're letting the side down, you're rejecting God, you're putting two fingers up against Moses by marrying somebody of a different faith. Now, obviously, it is much better in many ways and much easier if you marry this person of the same faith. Because then you're heading in the same direction, you're giving the children the same identity, and particularly within Judaism, but some other faiths too, it's a very domestic faith, and therefore it's not just about what you do out there, whether it's the church or the mosque, but what you do in the home. But having said that, there's no reason why, with compassion and common sense, you can't marry together two traditions. I mean, every marriage in a sense is a mixed marriage. You all do different things, different traditions, whether even if the same faith. And this was a matter of saying, look, it's happening, rather than, rabbis and priests slamming the phone down. You've just got to accommodate people. And also it was a massive own goal because, as I said, most people still wanted to be part of their community and wanted to pass on their heritage to their children. And this was a way of saying, okay, it's a new sociological reality. We have to get used to it and we have to work with it.
And Jonathan, I think I'm right in saying you're not in favor of faith schools.
Oh, no, this is another campaign. I'm very much in favor of faith, but not faith schools, because, what they do is they segregate children. And if you just step back and think about it, we wouldn't dream of sending children of different color to different schools. It would be illegal. We wouldn't dream of separating children by religion when they go into the cinema and saying, right, Hindus over there and Jews here and Muslims there. It'd just be laughable. And yet we do it at school. And what message does that send to the children? Don't mix. Different means strange. And it means they don't grow up together, and therefore they're ignorant of each other. And ignorance leads to suspicion, which leads to fear, and that can lead to hostility. And it's doubly daft when, as I'm sure most people here would agree, the school is for teaching values such as tolerance and understanding, and yet we segregate and differentiate, which is why I sent my children not to a Jewish school, and there was one locally, but to a local community school. I wanted them to, sit next to a Christian in class and play football with a Muslim in the break and do homework with a Hindu and get detention with a Methodist and walk home with a Sikh. And that way my children would get to know them my children. And not only would my children benefit, but society at large would benefit. And this, by the way, again, is a religious response. I mean, we would all subscribe, I hope, to love your neighbor as yourself, but you can't love your neighbor if you don't know your neighbor. And by the way, it also divides the parents, because the parents don't meet outside the school gate or at the school fete or the sports day or parents teachers evening. So they cut a huge swathe through society, and I think again, I got heavily criticised by the religious authorities, Jewish, Catholic, when we started up the Accord Coalition, which is still going strong. But I actually feel vindicated, and that the government itself has recognised this. And Accord had at least 2 successes in, as parents here will know, GCSE was changed. So instead of just being one subject, so that Catholics could then just do Catholicism and Jews just Judaism. Now, if you're doing GCSE RE, it has to be 2 subjects. So at least you have to study another faith. And also, Michael Gove was persuaded when he set up his free schools that all faith-based free schools had a cap of 50%, of no more than 50% of children from any one faith. Again, so you couldn't get schools 90%, 100% Catholic or Jewish or whatever. And I honestly think, religion comes from the home, from the church, the synagogue, the mosque, the gurdwara. School is for education and integration. And if we want a tolerant, open, inclusive society, then we have to have a tolerant, open, inclusive education system that's going to produce it.
I mean, Jonathan, nobody will think from this conversation that we're a secular society, but do you think we are becoming increasingly secular? Is religion, is faith becoming less important as time goes on?
Yes and no, in the sense that there's no doubt that organized religion is, and you just need to look at sort of the statistics for attendance at a church or synagogue for that matter, which by and large is on a downward spiral. And yet people may not necessarily like the formal worship, but they still asking the big questions. Who am I? What's the purpose of life? Where am I going next? What do I mean? How do I interact with society? And all these big faith questions. So faith has to perhaps do things differently, reach out. My own synagogue, to be honest, has changed enormously. And we've almost sort of rebranded ourselves from being a sort of, in business terms, from being a house of worship to a community centre.
And in what way changed, Jonathan?
Well, we are a community centre rather than a house of prayer, and that for us, yes, there's a synagogue, there's a prayer hall for worship, but that's actually in a small part of the building, and most of the building is there for social, cultural, educational, welfare activities, because that's where people are at.
Right, but does that not feel like a move away from faith, from religion?
It's a matter of combining it. It's a matter of saying it's not either or. You have to be religious to come to synagogue or to church. You can combine it in your own way. And to quote the New Testament, it should be a house with many doors. And frankly, I don't care which door people come in as long as they do enter.
Right. And you are on the Reform side of Judaism, but what is the state of Judaism at the moment in this country?
Numerically, it's quite small. It's still very active and religiously, culturally, but the numbers are small, and it's a fight. Being a rabbi is a great job, but it's also quite an uphill task sometimes, just to keep communities together, because just so many other distractions, temptations, And
what about, we do a lot of work here at St. George's House, as you know, on interfaith. And I just wondered about your relationships with the other faiths, with the Muslim faith, with the Catholic faith. Is progress being made?
Oh, yes, this is one of the good news stories of the last 50 years. There's been an absolute explosion of interfaith dialogue, almost overdoing it, to be honest. And there are just so many local interfaith groups that you sometimes sort of don't know which one to go to, frankly. But it's wonderful, because we're actually faiths which have been sort of either not talking to each other or even actively hostile, and now talking to each other very readily. It's almost de rigueur for a rabbi when he goes to a new congregation to get to know his local vicar or his priest and knock on the door of the mosque. And again, we've developed, whereas initially it was just largely Jews and Christians because of the shared Hebrew Bible, now it's very much for the local mosque, Gurdwara, Sikh temple as well. It's a multi-faith society, and we're really working together and benefiting as well. I mean, it's wonderful. And we do not just sort of religious meetings, but do cooperative activities, such as we run homeless lunches, and one day it's in the church, another day it's in the synagogue, and we coordinate very well.
And John, this is perhaps a rather personal question, but have you ever doubted your own faith? Have there been moments where you've thought, oh no, this is not for me?
No, but then I have to tell you that Judaism isn't just a matter of faith. Whereas Christianity is very much God-centered, Judaism is sort of less so. The church has the 13 articles of faith. We have the 10 commandments about do's and don'ts, and actually, in tradition, it's 613. And there's a saying that I rather like, which sort of sums things up, is that to be a good Jew, you don't have to believe in God. You just have to do what he says. In other words, it's very much the getting on with it, the ethics, the behavior, the way you interact with society. That's just as important. So yes, it's not just a matter of belief, it's a matter of interpersonal relationships.
Yeah. And I think I'm right in saying your wife is also a rabbi. Is that true?
It is true. In fact, I often think we should go to the Guinness Book of Records, because we were the first 2 rabbis in the world, as far as we know, to marry, because that's a fairly new within Judaism to allow female rabbis.
Right. And are you theologically on the same side, or does it get a bit hot and heavy?
We certainly just discuss theology over the cornflakes, yes.
And so a traditional day in the life of a rabbi, what would that look like? What would a normal day involve?
Well, as I said at the beginning, there's no such thing as a normal day. It's the variety, and it's very much, it's a bit of everything, a bit of personal study, personal reflection, very much being in the synagogue, in the community, but also, well, having said that, actually very, very rarely in my office, because I'm usually out and about, except in COVID times, visiting people at home, in a hospital, wherever, very much on the attitude of, if I'm going to go to them, and I start where they're at rather than where I'm at.
And of course, it is your life in the community, which I think did lead to your most recent book, Confessions of a Rabbi, which, if I remember rightly, caused quite a stir.
Yes, but a nice stir, I think. And it just charts the life of a rabbi, because my father, who was quite a wise person, made one awful mistake. He warned me about being a rabbi and said, I think you'll end up in an ivory tower. And boy, was he wrong. I mean, whether it's sort of weddings that go wrong, or funerals that are hijacked, or Machiavellian families, or all sorts of things. Being a rabbi is very much out there with the people.
And just going back to the interfaith dialogue, Jonathan, if I may, for a moment, one of the things St. George's House focuses on is scriptural reasoning. And what do you make of that? Is that a good way into interfaith dialogue?
Well, it doesn't really matter where you start, to be honest. It's whether your starting point is how do we read the Bible, or how are we going to tackle the climate change, or how are we going to deal with prejudice. It's the coming together, frankly. That's what's important.
Yeah. I mean, I think we notice here when we have the gatherings that there is a nervousness to begin with. So the defenses are up. But that soon changes once the work begins. But I do think there is still quite a way to go in interfaith relationships. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I mean, there are different stages. We went through the first stage, which is just having nice cups of tea and saying how nice it is and how we all subscribe to love your neighbour as yourself. Then we've sort of begun to move on to sort of the difficult texts, because all our scriptures actually say some things which maybe the other lot don't agree with. So it's a matter of tackling that, and also so much of religion is to do with culture. And there's an awful lot of hatred and prejudice, even in religious circles. But when you actually go and look at the text, it's not there. And it's a matter of sort of separating the truly religious, which is largely ethical, from all the cultural and historical accretions, and finding a way through. And also, frankly, sometimes saying, look, we've got it wrong. When we talked about tolerance, and we've talked, that's very much been a secular value that the religions have had to learn for the post-Enlightenment. Religions in the past have had a pretty exclusive view of life. I'm right, you're wrong, we're saved, you're damned. And we've had to learn to be much more tolerant and to sort of give way in order to create a middle space and some ground.
Right. Yeah. So it is moving in the right direction.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so if you were now thinking post-COVID, when this world gets back to normal, what do you think the issues are that we will need to deal with? I mean, I notice as in St. George's House, the same issues come round. Assisted dying is coming round again. Is there another area or other areas that you think a place like this should grapple with?
One thing the religions have all been good at is the theory of love your neighbor as yourself. But they've all been pretty bad at putting it into practice. And it's just such an obvious line that everyone will sign up to. But the COVID has really been a good example of sort of holding up a mirror to society. And it was a very varied picture, wasn't it? Because on the one hand, some people were extraordinarily selfish. Remember all the loo rolls, all the trolley rage and the fly tipping. And yet other people were incredibly altruistic and neighborly and did shopping and phoning and gave mini concerts from their balcony and front gardens. And we've got those both sides of us. It's like the story of a rabbi who always had a piece of paper in each pocket. And whenever he was feeling a bit sort of over the top, he would get out the piece of paper which said, you were created just above the animals, and that would sort of reduce him a bit. And when he was feeling a bit down, he would get out a piece of paper from the other pocket which said, you were created just below the angels, and he'd feel better himself. And that's where we are. We're hovering between our sort of animalistic, brutal nature and our sort of more altruistic, aspirational nature. And we need to sort of rejig the balance.
Right. And I think I noticed quite recently on, I think it was Twitter, when all the fuss was going on about lockdown over Christmas, etc. You were quite direct about that. There was an awful lot of fuss about Christmas, but there wasn't too much word about other religious festivals.
Oh, well, it wasn't so much that I thought that Christmas was being privileged. I just thought it was really, really bad mistake to have this sort of 5-day binge. Because, if you're a true Christian, then you will pray wherever you are, and God will hear your prayer wherever you are. And I just worry that there's going to be sort of a good lot of fun on the 23rd, 4th, 5th, 6th of December, and unfortunately a lot of funerals in January. And I just don't think it's worth it. And particularly as we know that the vaccine is around the corner, it's really important for people to hold their nerve and to hang out, to hold on till it arrives.
Good. And of course, we're running now close to the end of our time, Jonathan, and I don't want to finish on anything other than a positive note. But when you're not engaged in the religious life, what do you like to do, apart from supporting Reading, which I think it must be something of a penance as much as anything else?
Well, that just shows how out of touch you are with football, because we're actually riding at the top, which is rare, I must admit. Yes, my big goal in life, to use a religious football metaphor, is to transfer the passion that you get at a football pitch into the synagogue, where people come along in great numbers and sing their hearts out, and there's a wonderful camaraderie. And so if we can get half of the 25,000 that go to Reading to come to my synagogue, then I'll be very pleased.
Very good. Jonathan, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you tonight. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Thank you all.